Good afternoon, everybody. It's Bill Parnaby from the Bill Parnaby Team. Just a public service announcement. As of December the 1st, the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act has been changed and modified with some significant changes to it. But most importantly, how it will affect you is your understanding of working with a real estate agent in terms of the transaction on both the buying side and the selling side. So to begin with, I've included a copy in this recording of the guide itself. You'll see it in the button down below called Guide. If you click on that, it'll bring up a full version of what I'm going to present to you now, which will just take a few minutes to explain, because some of the changes, although they seem small, definitely will change the dynamics in terms of representation and who works for who in the transaction. So the whole idea of the evolution of this change to the Act was to provide more transparency and understanding and creating that trust, which is why it's now called the Trust and Real Estate Services Act of 2002. Why the 2002? I'm not sure. Probably because that's when they're trying to figure out how and when to start fixing it. So the guide is broken down to a number of things in terms of how to work with an agent, the risks of representing yourself, because it's now something you can choose to do, particularly on the buying side, signing a contract with the realtor or the realtor's brokerage, the idea of multiple representation, as well as how to make a complaint if you have a problem. God forbid you won't have one of those. In any case, I won't bore you with the details. I'll get you to some of the highlights. So you will benefit in terms of being a client from using your agent and the brokerage, in the sense that the agency will owe you undivided loyalty, which you can see as part of the cast here. Full disclosure, meaning you'll know everything there is to know about the transaction that has to do with your best interests. Confidentiality, meaning anything that has to do with why you're doing what you're doing will be protected at all times. And the avoidance of conflict of interest, should there be any. Now, the key thing here is the fact that you now have the option, especially as a seller, when you sign a listing agreement or a seller's representation agreement, to delegate me, for example, as your designated representative under the brokerage. Now, in practical terms, that's kind of what was always happening. Although you signed the agreement between the brokerage of Royal LePage, I was the one who would coordinate and represent you in terms of the listing agreement, putting forward the marketing, doing the negotiations. I always had your best interest in mind. That is not going to change. The only thing that's changing is it's being specifically designated on a piece of paper now that says my name is as your designated representative. Now, here's where it gets tricky. So in the past, if somebody were to call on your property for sale, we would field the call, meaning myself or anybody on the team. But the division of labor was always very clear. I always have represented the seller's interest. There's never been a change to that. The guys on the team, Justin and Lewis, would field the random calls or the inquiries that would come in. They would service those people. In other words, come and show the house, your house, to those people. And until those people decided to make an offer, they were not deemed to be clients yet. In the old days, they were referred to as customers. Well, the new act has removed the definition of customer. So the reality is that those guys can show your house under contract with the brokerage and with me as the representation for you as an extended service to help you, until such time that that buyer decides to do something on your property. And this is where it changes. So let's suppose that that buyer now decides he wants to put an offer on the property that I am your designated representative for, and Justin and Lewis have the buyer. Well, what now happens is that buyer has a choice. That buyer can engage Justin and Lewis under a designated representation agreement to represent them as the buying side, which then keeps them separate from you, even though they're on my team. To me, this is a blessing, and that is because even though we did it in practice before, now it's formalized, is that they would represent the interests of the buying, and I would always represent the interest of the seller. That way, there was a complete division. And in that division, we would always keep things confidential. We would always do full disclosure. We would always have undivided loyalty. Those guys wouldn't know anything about our conversations. I don't know anything about their conversations. And at the end, the job is to put the transaction together where everybody feels like they've done okay. The only spoiler that could happen would be if that buyer decides that they want to move ahead and now go on to another house. So they came and looked at yours. They don't want yours for whatever reason. In the past, my guys would just say, okay, great, let's start looking at other houses. The new legislation is very clear that if they do that, they then become an extension of every other listing agent's property, despite the brokerage relationship. So therefore, they cannot technically service that buyer and go down the street and show another brokerage's listing without having a contract signed. So when and if you get into the buying marketplace and you start to hear agents asking you to sign buyer representation agreements, This is where it's coming from. So in the government's wisdom of trying to make things simple, as usual, it becomes a little bit more complex, but not really. So at the end of the day, that's the whole thing, is that on the listing agreement, the brokerage, and likely me, because this is going out to all the people that I know and have represented in the past or currently represent, I will be the designated representative to represent you in a client relationship. This is what we signed originally with the working with a realtor form. Now, the buying side is a completely separate entity. Even though the fee structure, the fee is still paid out through the listing brokerage to pay whoever brings the buyer, there is just significantly clearer representation boundaries. And to make something extremely clear is that if one of my people decide to partner up with a buyer and sign them under contract and bring them to the table to sell your home with me as the representation, it does not change the fee structure, because they are deemed to be independent contractors under a separate agreement, and nonetheless, they are treated as independent contractors as if they were from the brokerage, not from my team. So that's a change. The only way that we can have any concession, for example, would be, as I say, as always, is that if I personally bring the buyer to your home, in which case I would sign a designated representation agreement with you and the buyer to represent both parties on the same transaction. That would impact any negotiations we would have on the fee structure or concessions on the fee structure, if there were to be any. So I hope I didn't confuse that. The rest of this documentation that's here is knowing the risks of representing yourself, which of course doesn't apply so much to the selling side, it's more to the buying side in this example. It talks about what happens when they work for the other side, what they can and cannot do, that you have the right to change your mind. And this is what we've always done, is that when you become a client, especially as a seller, you sign a representation agreement with the brokerage, and that's a contract between you and the brokerage for real estate services and representation. In many ways, nothing has changed, but slight nuances. So what's going to happen going forward is that this document now will be presented to each and every one of you who decide to come to market, and especially for those who I'm sending this to who are already on the market with us. We will have to now send you this document. You'll have to read it over. You'll have to sign at the bottom that says you received it from us and that you understand it. And we will have to modify the current listing agreements to reflect the revised forms that came into place in December for the 2024 season. The other thing at the end of the day, again, you can expire, you can terminate, there's holdover clauses. None of that stuff is new, but multiple representation, again, is something that will show up, but everybody has to consent to it before it happens. Meaning, if I represent your home as a seller, designated representative, and let's just say that I come with the buyer, again, with a representation agreement for the buyer, before we move forward with any proposals of offers or negotiations, both the seller and the buyer would have to agree up front that the circumstances have arose that I would represent two parties. Now, let's be honest. The likelihood of that happening is fairly low because we are outnumbered 77,000 agents to 1 on the Toronto Real Estate Board. But the same model would apply if it was one of the members of my team who brought a buyer, because they would be designated as a buyer's rep and I would be your listing rep. So in essence, you got the same brokerage working with two people on the same trade. So you can see how it can kind of get a little bit confusing. Okay. So at the end of the day, I'm going to send this out to everybody. Please click on the link. If you have any interest, obviously in terms of future plans to sell, this would be a great opportunity for you to read this, and then we would have a conversation to clarify the mud. And for those of you who are currently listed with us, it's important that you read this and sign this, and we have a conversation about it. The other thing that's a big change that you want to know about is the possibility now for the seller during the course of negotiations, and this all spawned from the crazy market during COVID, where the seller now has the right to choose to have what's called open bidding or open offer process. This simply means that you have the right as a seller during negotiation to allow your designated representative, or me, your listing agent, to disclose the contents or some of the contents of the offer to competing bids in order to get them to do what they need to do to up the ante or make it better. Now, in all honesty, most sellers in the past would never do that, because the blind bidding, as the media called it, sometimes allowed the buying agent to come in and drop a large amount of cash on the table, which won the day. So if you had an offer that you were disclosing to the world, the price that you have on it, and you got 5 offers, and you told the other 4 agents, the certain number that's on the table, they could literally up the ante by $1,000, and you could potentially miss out on the $50,000 blind bid that was going to come in and win the day. But on the other hand, you may want to disclose things like, well, the closing we're looking for, and that would be ideal, would be this date. So there's pros and cons to it, but that's why the consultation process with your designated representative would allow us to decide when, where, and how, or if we were going to, put this strategy to work. Okay, so it's always been in place, but now it's formalized. And every time we do something, whether you decide to go open bid, there has to be documentation. If after we do it and you want to take it back or rescind that option, there's documentation. So there's going to be paperwork out the yin yang, but they're trying to make it more transparent so that everybody has the right to do what they want to do and signs off on it. So when you get this brochure, you'll see the whole thing. The last part of it, which is always there, is about how you make a complaint, which means if something doesn't seem right, well, obviously come to me first and we'll have a conversation to try and clarify it. If there's an issue with another brokerage or another broker or another agent, then you can always contact RICO, and the Real Estate Council of Ontario will investigate the situation and try to get clarity for you. But I thought it was important to get this out to you because it's going to start to come full circle now, where you'll see it more and more, because literally it was only launched on the 1st of December. And now we're starting to see a few of these things impact the marketplace. And it's just really important that we all have clarity. So this is the form, the acknowledgement section. My name is pre-filled. All it would be is a date where we provided the brochure, the signature that I would sign when we did that, and then your acknowledgement that you actually received it and that you had a chance to read it and or have it explained to you by me, which is the purpose of this video. So going forward, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're all on the learning curve, but at the end of the day, we're trying to make it better for the consumer, and we at the team here are completely on board and support that. So thank you for your time. I know it's been about a 10-minute video, but if you have any questions, please reach out. Email is bill@billparnaby.com, and we look forward to being of service.